She traveled 1,000 miles with 2 hungry toddlers, only for her intended groom to take one look, spit in the dust, and walk away. Stranded in a brutal frontier town, a desperate mother finds salvation not in a fairy tale, but in a cynical doctor's startling proposition. The train brakes screamed against the iron tracks, a sound like tearing metal that made 4-year-old Leo bury his face in Maeve's wool skirt. Steam hissed, thick and smelling of scorched water and coal ash. Maeve Gallagher stepped down onto the platform of Bitter Creek. The wind hit her immediately. It wasn't a breeze. It was a physical blow carrying grit that stung her cheeks and coated her teeth in chalk. She gripped the handles of her carpet bag until her knuckles bled white under the skin. With her other hand, she held firmly to Lucy. Leo clung to her leg. They had made it. 8 days of stale bread, crying jags, and the suffocating heat of the third-class car. She scanned the platform. The men here wore canvas and corduroy stained with grease and livestock mud. They moved with a hurried, brutal efficiency. None of them looked like a man expecting a bride. Then a shadow fell over her. "You the Gallagher woman?" Maeve looked up. Hiram Cobb was taller than she had imagined from his cramped, misspelled letters. He was built like an anvil, broad and immovable, with a beard the color of rusted wire. His eyes were small, dark, and flat as coins. "I am," Maeve said. She straightened her spine, forcing the exhaustion from her voice. "Mr. Cobb, I presume. It is a pleasure to finally—" "What are those?" Cobb interrupted. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at her hemline. Lucy shrank back. Leo gripped the wool tighter. Maeve swallowed the lump of panic rising in her throat. "These are my children, Leo and Lucy." Cobb didn't blink. He just stared. "I asked for a wife, a woman to tend the stove, pluck chickens, and keep the dugout clean. I didn't ask for a litter." "I am a hard worker, Mr. Cobb," Maeve said, her voice dropping, stripping away the polite veneer she had prepared. "I can do all of that and more. They're quiet. They eat little. They will help when they are grown. Their mouths." Cobb spat a stream of brown tobacco juice onto the planks near her worn boots. "And they're sickly looking. I ain't running a charity ward, lady. You omitted this little detail in your letters." "I wrote that I was a widow seeking a fresh start," Maeve fired back, her heart hammering against her ribs. "A fresh start for my family." "You played me for a fool." Cobb adjusted his suspenders, turning his back to the wind. "Well, the joke's on you. I ain't marrying you. Contract's void." "Mr. Cobb, please." The words tasted like ash, but pride was a luxury she had left back in Chicago. "I spent my last dollar on the rail ticket. I have nowhere else to go." Cobb didn't look back. He just stepped off the platform and vanished into the bustling street. Maeve stood frozen. The wind howled through the slats of the depot. She looked down at the 2 small faces looking up at her, waiting for instructions. Her stomach clenched. Survival made liars out of desperate people, but it seemed the truth was far crueler. She had $2 hidden in her corset, half a loaf of stale bread in her bag, and no shelter in a town that looked ready to swallow them whole. Across the street, behind the grime-streaked window of the town's only medical clinic, Dr. Arthur Pendleton watched the scene unfold. Arthur struck a match, the sulfur flaring bright in the dim room, and touched it to the end of his cigarette. He took a long drag, exhaling smoke against the glass. He had seen the entire exchange. He didn't need to hear the words to know what had happened. Cobb was a miserable, tight-fisted son of a bitch on the best of days. The woman had been rejected. Arthur rubbed a hand over his face. His fingers felt like sandpaper. He hadn't slept in 2 days, fighting a losing battle against a typhoid outbreak at the rail camp 5 miles out. The clinic smelled permanently of carbolic acid, dried blood, and old coffee. He looked back at the woman on the platform. She wasn't weeping. She wasn't throwing a hysterical fit. She was simply standing there, shielding the children from the wind with her own body, thinking. Her jaw was set. "Turn away," Arthur told himself. "Not your circus, not your corpses." He turned away from the window, walked to his desk, and poured 2 fingers of rye whiskey into a cloudy glass. He had buried his own wife 3 years ago in the frozen mud of a December morning. Since then, Arthur had walled himself off, becoming little more than a machine that fixed broken bones and handed out laudanum. Emotion was a liability on the frontier. Pity was a luxury that usually got you killed or broke. He downed the whiskey. It burned, but it didn't warm him. Outside, the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Rockies. The temperature was going to plummet. By nightfall, Maeve had learned exactly what Bitter Creek thought of a single mother. The boarding house required $5 a week in advance. The mercantile owner wouldn't let her sweep the floors in exchange for a blanket, eyeing her with a mixture of suspicion and predatory interest she knew all too well. The saloon was out of the question. She wouldn't take her children into a place where gunshots periodically punctuated the piano music. They ended up huddled in the narrow alley between the assayer's office and the clinic. It was out of the wind, but the cold was creeping up from the ground, seeping through the soles of their shoes. "Mama, I'm cold," Lucy whispered. Her voice was raspy. Maeve opened her coat and pulled both children inside, wrapping her arms around them. "I know, Bird, I know. We'll find something tomorrow. Just sleep now." She knew they wouldn't survive the night out here, not with the frost already forming on the wooden barrels nearby. She was calculating the risk of breaking into the depot waiting room when the back door of the clinic swung open. Warm yellow light spilled into the alley. A man stood in the doorway. He was tall, lean to the point of gauntness, with dark hair silvering at the temples and a face lined with deep, permanent exhaustion. He wore a blood-stained apron over a white shirt. Arthur held a lantern up. The light caught the terrified eyes of the twins and the defensive, feral glare of their mother. "It's dropping to 20 degrees tonight," Arthur said. His voice was gravelly, devoid of any soothing bedside manner. "You'll freeze to death before sunrise." Maeve tightened her grip on her children. "We are fine. Just resting." "You're a terrible liar," Arthur said flatly. He stepped back and gestured inside with a jerk of his chin. "Get in here. I don't have the time or the energy to thaw out 3 corpses tomorrow morning." Maeve hesitated. Trusting men in this town had already cost her everything. But Lucy shivered violently against her ribs. She stood up, grabbed her bag, and herded the twins through the door. The clinic was a chaotic mess. Stacks of medical journals served as impromptu tables. Jars of preserved specimens lined a dusty shelf. But the cast-iron stove in the corner was roaring, radiating a fierce, beautiful heat. "Sit near the stove," Arthur ordered. He walked to a cupboard and pulled out a tin of crackers and a jar of preserved peaches. He set them roughly on a table near the fire, along with 3 forks. "Eat." Leo and Lucy didn't wait for permission. They attacked the peaches like starved animals. Maeve took a single cracker, her stomach too knotted to handle more. "Thank you, Doctor." "Pendleton. Arthur Pendleton." He stripped off the bloody apron and threw it into a basket. He walked over to a hand pump, splashing freezing water over his face and hands. "Saw Cobb ditch you at the depot." Maeve flushed, staring at the floorboards. "He found my circumstances unacceptable. Cobb is a jackass who thinks women are draft horses." Arthur grabbed a towel and dried his face. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms, and really looked at her. She was thin, battered by travel, with dark circles under her eyes. But she hadn't broken. He respected that. He looked at the kids. They were small, quiet, and currently smeared with peach syrup. Arthur's house, attached to the back of the clinic, was a disaster. He hadn't eaten a hot meal in months. He was drowning in his own practice, neglecting his health, his home, his ledgers. He needed help. But you couldn't hire decent help in Bitter Creek. Anyone worth their salt was mining silver or working the cattle lines. He needed a partner, not a lover, not a romance, just someone to hold the line while he worked. "How much money do you have?" Arthur asked. Maeve stiffened. $2. If you are asking for payment for the food, I can work it off. I don't want your money. Arthur walked over to his desk, grabbed a piece of blank paper and a dip pen. He brought them back to the table and sat opposite her. "I have a proposition for you, Mrs. Gallagher. It's Maeve." Maeve. He locked eyes with her. His eyes weren't cruel, but they weren't warm either. They were purely practical. "I am a widower. My wife died 3 years ago. I have no intention of ever replacing her in my heart or in my bed. However, I am working myself into an early grave. My house is a shambles. I eat cold beans from a can. I need a housekeeper, a ledger keeper, and someone to ensure this place doesn't burn down while I'm out setting legs." Maeve frowned, confused. "You want to hire me?" "I want to marry you," Arthur corrected without missing a beat. Maeve dropped the cracker. "Excuse me? Listen to me." Arthur leaned forward. "If I just hire you, the town will talk. The women will brand you a harlot, and the men will assume you're available for extracurricular activities. It will be dangerous for you and the kids. But if you have my ring on your finger and my name, nobody in Bitter Creek will look at you sideways. You get a permanent roof, unlimited food, and a safe place to raise your children. I get a managed household and a quiet life." He tapped the pen on the table. "It's a business contract, Maeve. Nothing more. You have your room, I have mine. We treat each other with respect. I won't ever ask for a husband's privileges. But you must be loyal, and you must run this house." Maeve stared at him. The man was serious. He was proposing marriage to a woman he had met 10 minutes ago, solely to get his floors swept and his ledgers balanced. It was absurd. It was offensive. It was a lifeline. She looked at Leo and Lucy. They had finished the peaches and were leaning against each other by the stove, their eyelids heavy with sleep. If she walked out that door tomorrow, they would be right back in the dirt. She looked back at Arthur. "You don't know anything about me. I could rob you blind." "If you do, the sheriff is a good friend of mine," Arthur said dryly. "But I don't think you will. A woman who stands in front of a prairie wind to shield her kids isn't a petty thief. She's a survivor." Maeve traced the grain of the wood on the table. No sweet words, no promises of eternal love. Just a raw, pragmatic deal struck in the smell of iodine and wood smoke. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning. The judge owes me a favor for pulling a bullet out of his idiot brother." Arthur pushed the paper and pen toward her. "Write down your terms. Anything you need for the children. I'll sign it. Then we get some sleep." Maeve picked up the pen. Her hand was trembling just a little. She wrote, "Separate bedrooms, clothing and schooling for Leo and Lucy. Mutual respect." She pushed it back to him. Arthur read it, nodded once, and signed his name at the bottom with a sharp, aggressive flourish. Arthur Pendleton, M.D. He stood up. "Take the bedroom down the hall. I'll sleep on the cot in the clinic." He paused at the door, looking back at her. "Welcome to Bitter Creek, Mrs. Pendleton. The wedding took exactly 4 minutes. Judge Higgins, nursing a vicious hangover and a cup of black coffee, read the vows in a rapid-fire mumble. Arthur handed over a $2 fee. He placed a plain silver band on Maeve's finger. It was cold and slightly too large. "Right," Arthur said, turning away, before the judge had even finished blotting the marriage certificate. "I have a breech berth at the Miller farm. Don't expect me before sundown." He walked out. Maeve stood in the dusty office, looking down at the ring. It wasn't a promise of devotion. It was a shield forged in silver. She went back to the clinic and went to war. For the first week, Arthur barely saw her. He left before dawn and returned long after dark. But the evidence of her presence was undeniable. The paralyzing layer of grime that had coated his life for 3 years was systematically eradicated. The clinic floors smelled of sharp lye soap and lemon oil. His surgical instruments were boiled, polished, and lined up with military precision. Most shockingly, he came home on the 8th day to find a plate of hot roast beef, carrots, and potatoes waiting on the stove, covered with a clean cloth. Arthur sat at the table and ate in silence. He hadn't realized how hollowed out he had become until the warm food hit his stomach. He looked across the hallway. Maeve's bedroom door was shut. The twins were quiet. The chaotic, drowning sensation that usually accompanied him home was gone. He had bought a housekeeper. He had gotten an army. The real test came a month later. November brought driving sleet and a Saturday night payday at the local silver mine. Violence was the inevitable result. Arthur was in his study, trying to decipher his own chaotic handwriting in the ledger, when the clinic door kicked open. 2 miners dragged in a third. The man was clutching his abdomen, blood welling dark and heavy through his fingers, dripping onto Maeve's freshly scrubbed floorboards. "Knife fight," one of the miners grunted, dumping the man onto the examination table. Arthur was already moving. "Get out, both of you." He stripped off his coat and rolled up his sleeves. The wound was deep, slicing through the muscle. Arterial blood pulsed in a steady, terrifying rhythm. Arthur clamped a hand over the wound, applying brutal pressure. He needed forceps. He needed sutures. He needed 3 hands. "Doctor?" Arthur jerked his head up. Maeve stood in the doorway. She wore a simple cotton nightgown and a thick shawl, her hair braided down her back. She looked from Arthur to the bleeding man. She didn't scream. She didn't faint. "I need clamps," Arthur barked, his voice tight with strain. "Top drawer left side. Drop them in the carbolic acid basin first." Maeve moved. She was fast, her hands steady as she fished the metal clamps from the stinging chemical bath and handed them to him. "Hold this," Arthur commanded. He guided her hands to the folded gauze, pressing into the man's stomach. "Press hard. Don't let up, no matter how much he thrashes." The miner groaned, arching his back. Maeve leaned her entire body weight onto her hands, her face pale, but her jaw locked tight. Blood seeped through the gauze, warm and sticky, staining her fingers. She didn't flinch. For 45 minutes, the clinic was a silent battleground of steel, thread, and sweat. Arthur worked with a brutal, practiced speed, tying off the bleeders and stitching the muscle. Maeve anticipated him. When he reached for a sponge, she had it ready. When he needed more light, she adjusted the kerosene lamp without being asked. Finally, Arthur tied the last suture and snipped the gut thread. He stepped back, wiping his forehead with the back of a bloody forearm. The man was unconscious, pale but breathing steadily. Arthur looked at Maeve. Her hands were coated in blood. Her shawl was ruined. She stood by the table, chest heaving slightly, staring at the unconscious miner. "Go wash up," Arthur said quietly. Maeve walked to the pump. She scrubbed her hands with lye soap until the skin was raw and red. Arthur watched her. He had seen seasoned deputies pass out from the sight of less blood. "You did well," he said. It was the highest praise he knew how to give. Maeve dried her hands. She turned to look at him. The clinical detached barrier between them had fractured. In the harsh lamplight, Arthur saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but also a fierce, undeniable strength. "He'll live?" she asked. "Because of you holding pressure," Arthur replied. "Yes." "Good." Maeve walked past him toward the hallway. She paused at the door. "Your ledgers were a disgrace, by the way. I spent 3 hours untangling your accounts. The livery owes you $40. I intend to collect it tomorrow." Arthur stared at her, retreating back, a rare, genuine bark of laughter escaping his throat. "Good luck," he called out. She didn't need luck. The next afternoon, Maeve returned with $40 and a sack of oats. Winter settled over Bitter Creek like a suffocating blanket. The town stopped staring at them. Hiram Cobb had tried to start a rumor about Maeve in the saloon, only to be loudly shut down by the sheriff and by the 2 miners whose friend was recovering in Arthur's clinic. She was Mrs. Pendleton now. Untouchable. The house found a rhythm. Leo and Lucy learned to navigate the grumpy doctor. They figured out that Arthur hated noise in the morning, but would invariably leave peppermint drops on the kitchen table after a long trip. Arthur, in turn, learned that Leo was terrified of the dark and silently fixed a broken lantern to leave burning in the hallway. They were coexisting. It was efficient. It was safe. It wasn't love. Until the typhoid came back. It started at the logging camp north of town. Arthur spent 3 days up there, fighting a losing battle against contaminated water and stubborn men. When he finally rode back into Bitter Creek, the snow was falling in thick, heavy sheets. Maeve heard his horse in the yard. She opened the back door, wiping flour from her hands, ready to scold him for not wearing his heavier wool coat. The words died in her throat. Arthur practically fell from the saddle. He stumbled toward the steps, his face flushed a dark, unnatural red, his breathing shallow and ragged. Maeve caught him before he hit the porch. His skin was radiating heat like a cast-iron stove. "Arthur," she gasped, buckling under his weight. "Keep," he wheezed, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "Keep the kids away. Contagious." He slumped against her, dead weight. Panic, sharp and icy, pierced Maeve's chest. She didn't scream. She dragged him inside, hauling his long, heavy frame down the hall and into his bedroom. She stripped off his snow-soaked clothes, her hands flying over buttons and buckles. She locked the hallway door. "Leo! Lucy!" she yelled through the wood. "Stay in your room. Do not come out." For the next 4 days, the house became a quarantine ward. Maeve didn't sleep. The pragmatic contract they had signed dissolved in basins of ice water and soiled sheets. Arthur was lost to the fever. He thrashed in the bed, shouting medical orders to people who weren't there. He called out for his dead wife, his voice cracking with an old buried grief that made Maeve's throat tighten. She sat beside him, bathing his face with cold water, forcing drops of willow bark tea past his cracked lips. "I am a widower. I have no intention of replacing her." His words echoed in her mind. She had accepted those terms. But as she wiped the sweat from his chest, listening to his ragged breathing, she realized the terrifying truth. She wasn't just guarding her provider. She was terrified of losing him. The grumpy, exhausted man who left peppermints for her children and trusted her with a bleeding man's life had rooted himself deep in her chest. On the 4th night, the storm outside broke. The wind died down, leaving a heavy, ringing silence over the town. Maeve was sitting in the wooden chair beside the bed. Her head was tipped back against the wall. her eyes burning with exhaustion. She had run out of ice. She had run out of medicine. There was nothing left to do but wait. A sudden stillness from the bed made her snap awake. The thrashing had stopped. Arthur was lying flat on his back. Maeve held her breath, leaning forward, pressing 2 fingers to the hollow of his throat. His pulse was slow, steady. The terrible radiating heat was gone. His skin felt cool and damp. The fever had broken. Maeve let out a breath that sounded like a sob. She slumped forward, resting her forehead against the edge of the mattress, her hand still resting lightly on his chest. Just to feel it rise and fall. "You're crushing my ribs." The voice was barely a whisper, hoarse as sandpaper. Maeve's head snapped up. Arthur's eyes were open. They were sunken and ringed with dark bruises of exhaustion, but they were clear. He was looking at her. "Arthur!" She scrambled to sit up, her hands fluttering over him, suddenly unsure where to put them. "You're awake. I'll get you some water." She reached for the pitcher, but his hand shot out. His grip was weak, but his fingers wrapped firmly around her wrist. He didn't let go. He looked at her. Really looked at her. He took in the dark circles under her eyes, the stained dress, the absolute exhaustion etched into every line of her face. He remembered the fever dreams, the suffocating heat, and the constant anchoring presence of her hands holding him down, pulling him back. "You stayed," he rasped. "Of course I stayed," Maeve said, her voice trembling slightly. "We have a contract, remember? I'm your housekeeper." Arthur closed his eyes for a brief second, a ghost of a smile touching his cracked lips. He turned his head, looking out the frost-covered window at the pale morning light. "Contract's void," he whispered. Maeve's heart stopped. The air vanished from the room. "What?" Arthur slowly turned his gaze back to her. His thumb moved, weakly brushing against the pulse point on her wrist. The cynical, walled-off doctor was gone, burned away by the fever. "I don't need a housekeeper, Maeve," he said, his voice carrying a quiet, absolute certainty. "I need my wife." He shifted his hand, interlacing his fingers with hers. The silver band on her finger caught the pale morning light. Maeve looked down at their joined hands. The fear and the cold of the past year melted away, replaced by something solid and fiercely warm. She didn't need to say it back. The proof was in the lye soap, the balanced ledgers, and the vigil of the last 4 days. "Then you'd better drink your water, Dr. Pendleton," she said softly, squeezing his hand back. "You have a livery bill to collect." Outside, the sun crested the Rockies, painting the snow in blinding gold. The bitter wind was gone. If Maeve and Arthur's gritty frontier love story struck a chord with you, hit that like button. True romance isn't always a fairy tale. Sometimes it's built in the trenches of survival, forged by lye soap, grit, and unexpected loyalty. Share the story with someone who appreciates a raw, slow-burn Western drama. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another deep, emotional tale from the wild frontier.